IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi and I have with me my colleague Aditya Ramanathan. And we are going to discuss in the context of the exciting kind of wait for Chandrayaan-3 to land on the south pole of the moon, that why countries are running to go to the moon again after a bill of about almost 50 years when Russia and the US did significant lunar exploration. Why this new interest? And you see a lot of countries, the US, China, Russia, and India, obviously, are trying to go back to the moon. So we'll just unpack why that is the case. What is the newfound interest? Is there any role of geopolitics in this? Or is this just purely scientific venture? So a very warm welcome, Aditya. Let's unpack this.
Thanks so much, Saurabh. Yeah, to begin with, where we are with Chandrayaan-3, we're recording this on the morning of 21st August, Monday. And Chandrayaan-3 is supposed to land on the 23rd of August. The lander Vikram is supposed to make its landing. We don't know if it's going to be successful, but regardless of the outcome of the mission, I think what is important for us to keep in mind and to discuss is, why on earth everybody's suddenly interested in the moon again, right? 20 years back, it was barely any interest in the moon. So yeah, this comes in the context, obviously, Chandrayaan-3 of several other lunar probes. Most recently we've had the crash, like you pointed out, of the Lunar 25 Russian probe. And, these are very, very difficult missions to carry out, and soft landings on the moon. The moon has almost zero atmosphere and low gravity, and just making a soft landing there is very difficult. And only two countries have really gotten good at it, which is primarily the US, but also now China. And India's own Chandrayaan-2, which tried to make a very ambitious soft landing near the moon's south pole, not quite on the south pole, but near it. That also failed. And, I think it's important for us to have some empathy with all these missions, in the sense that all these kind of missions are extremely difficult and there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. It's not simply gravitational mechanics. The scientists and engineers will tell you about so many things, ranging from, power, radiation, electrostatic interference, all sorts of things that get in the way of these missions. Lots of practical things to debug. But yeah, why on earth is everybody going back? And, to me, one of the most interesting missions to the moon of late is not Lunar 25 or even Chandrayaan-3, as much as I hope for it, but it's actually another failed mission in which a private Japanese company launched its Hakuto R spacecraft to carry a UAE rover to the moon on a SpaceX launch vehicle. So you have a UAE, which is not a country you would normally think of as a space power. And, the UAE, basically goes to space by, sort of outsourcing a lot of its capabilities and then, integrating them and doing project management at home in the UAE. And you have two private companies involved here. You have this very ambitious, relatively small Japanese company teaming up with the American behemoth SpaceX to launch this vehicle. This happened earlier this year and it failed. Again, soft landings are very difficult to do. But the very fact that there was such a serious minded effort being carried out and being private sector led tells you that something really has changed, right? Humans essentially went to the moon over a roughly 3-year period between 1969 and 1972. And if I'm not mistaken, 12 humans who went to the moon. They're all Americans. All of them were born between the year 1928 and 1935, right? So nobody born after 1935 has actually been to the moon. In fact, nobody who's been born after 1935 has even gone beyond low Earth orbit. Right? Some 600 people have gone up to low Earth orbit since humans started going into space in 1959. But we've basically for 50 years stopped going beyond low Earth orbit, which is extraordinary. And so I'm saying this because fact that humans are returning now to the moon, or at least making plans to return to the moon, is a fairly momentous and potentially really historic and perhaps world-changing phenomena, right? So the most ambitious project, the one that we know about, is the American Artemis program, like you mentioned. And Artemis program, is to put it in a nutshell, Artemis says we'll go go back to the moon now, but this time we'll go to stay. We're not going to leave, right? And this is, in a sense, an extension of what the US has already been doing in low Earth orbit. So if you've been keeping track, there have been people continuously in low Earth orbit now for 22 years, right? So this is because of the International Space Station. Humans have basically been there permanently in low Earth orbit. And now you have, of course, China's Tiangong as well. And so even after the International Space Station, is decommissioned in 2030 or 31, there's a plan for anywhere between 3 to 4 private space stations to take over and basically continue this idea that humans will permanently remain in low Earth orbit. And, there are always going to be people there. And the idea is ultimately to extend that to the moon. And obviously, this is a fairly momentous thing. And, Americans are obviously planning to do this in multiple stages. So this really began in November 22, when you had the launch of an uncrewed Artemis 1 mission to the moon. This seems to have broadly gone well. The next step is Artemis 2, which is going to take a crew of humans past the moon. And in fact, this is not only going to be the first time that humans, in 50 years, that humans cross low Earth orbit, it will also be the furthest that humans have been from Earth ever, right? So Artemis 2 itself is going to be a historic mission. And then there's the Artemis 3 mission, which is meant to land 2 astronauts at the moon's south pole for a plan of 6 days. So, 2 people will land on the moon and 2 people will remain in orbit. Now, the date for this mission was supposed to be originally 2024. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Then it became 2025, probably 2026. Further delays are possible, and it's even possible that the mission is sort of downgraded to simply remaining in orbit first. Lunar missions are always going to be subject to these delays, so we should not be surprised if these dates are pushed further and further. But notwithstanding these delays, this is an incredibly ambitious project, because the idea is to set up some sort of lunar habitation, to have a lunar gateway space station which will remain in orbit around the moon. It's a fairly small space station, but it's one where people can stay for long periods of time. The Americans also plan to put in place what they call a Lunar Communication Relay and Navigation System, or LCRNS. And this is basically a lunar satellite constellation that's a bit like GPS on Earth. So it's like GPS for the moon, but also has some communication capability. And the idea is, if you want to navigate on the moon, if, for example, probes like Chandrayaan or the Hakuto R or the Luna 25 will all be free to use this navigation system when they're getting close to the moon, when they're landing there to figure out where they are, when they're sending out probes. The idea is to make lunar exploration much easier by setting up this kind of infrastructure. And finally, Artemis is also, again, like we talked about with the Hakuto R, it's highly dependent on American private players like SpaceX, but also like Blue Origin. And you also have, it's not just an American mission, though it's an American-led mission. You have Japan's JAXA, you have the European Space Agency, both involved with various parts of the project. For example, the ESA is developing what they call the European Large Logistics Lander, or ELLL. And this is basically a spaceship meant to ferry cargo between the Earth and the moon, right? So, this is a well thought out plan. And what makes it different from the Apollo missions is the Apollo missions were extremely ambitious and it got people to the moon, but there was no strategy for what to do next. And there was also no good reason beyond the space race for going to the moon. Those things might be slightly changing now. And this is why the current race to the moon, or crawl to the moon, or, more marathon than sprint to the moon is interesting, and it's probably going to be different in its outcomes from the Apollo program.
And it is, in a way, I think remarkable that, it's a cross-country effort. So it's not, like during Cold War, that it was a US trying to go to space, or the Soviets. So it's trying to, include more players and have a more kind of collaborative effort. So it was announced when the PM Modi went to the US for the visit in June, that India has actually signed Artemis Accords now. So what role will India play? And is this more like, okay, we want to be part of this bigger plan, or are we going to be an active player? Or what is plans of the Indian Space Agency or the government regarding Artemis and its role?
Sure. Yeah. This brings us to something you had mentioned earlier also, which is, is there geopolitics involved in this? And the short answer is yes, of course. There always is, right, with these kind of things. So, here's one simple reason for, why India might have signed, what are the consequences of India signing the Artemis Accords? The first thing is the Artemis Accords is, it's a set of principles. So signing the Accords doesn't necessarily mean you join the Artemis program, but it is certainly a prerequisite to joining the Artemis program. But the first thing that signing the Artemis Accords does on Earth, the first practical result is it's a powerful political signal, right? So it does point to which direction India is leaning to in alignments between great powers today, right? So if you're Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin right now, you are, you do want to maintain your relationship with India, but you see that, you're drifting apart. You're absorbed with your war in Ukraine, and this news comes in about Artemis. You may not really care so much about lunar exploration because it's not something urgent right now, but it is a clear political signal to you about which way India is leaning. So that's the first most obvious consequence. But in terms of the reasons for India signing this, I think there's been a gradual evolution. The Artemis Accords came to being in 2020. Now, 2020 was also the year in which there were massive policy changes in India in terms of its space policy. So first, the sector was opened up, to the private sector, to private companies. You had the creation of InSpace as a sort of regulator cum promoter. And then earlier this year, with Space Policy 2023, you had a very clear indication from the government that private companies could be engaged in commercial recovery of space resources. So that would mean including lunar resources. The other point is that, if you're a diplomat in Delhi, you know perfectly well that, reaching some sort of big overarching international framework for lunar governance, in the immediate future is not going to happen, right? So, I mean, these type of agreements happen usually in a broader context of, countries coming together to figure out, okay, we have to figure out how to manage our competition. Unfortunately, the US and China are not there yet. Typically, these things happen after some sort of crisis. And it means that it's unlikely you're going to come to any sort of overarching agreement. You're seeing this already with, for example, at the UN ODA, there are open-ended working groups on reducing space threats. And what's actually happening is simply that you have the US and Western countries on one camp and Russia and China in another, and India somewhere in between. And so, India has obviously seen this sort of thing and knows that we're not going to get to any sort of big lunar agreement, right? India, by the way, is already a signatory to something called the Moon Treaty, which was introduced in 1979. But none of the major spacefaring countries at that time actually signed this agreement. It was just a bunch of smaller countries that signed it. And essentially, the Moon Treaty said, if you extract resources from the moon, you have to share it for the benefit of all mankind, which is something that is just open to interpretation, right? It could mean anything. So you have countries that have, India, Australia, Saudi Arabia is a different matter, but India and Australia, for example, and France are countries that signed the Moon Treaty, but have also become signatories to the Artemis Accords. Saudi Arabia is interesting because it actually exited the Moon Treaty and then signed the Artemis Accords. But, the case that, for example, Australia has made is that there's no contradiction between the Moon Treaty and the Artemis Accords, which do explicitly allow for resource extraction. It should just be made clear. That's one of the big controversies with the Artemis Accords, is that it makes space very clearly for, deconfliction, for protection of heritage sites. Heritage sites means America doesn't want anybody to go around messing with its Apollo 11 landing site, right? Because they think it's of historic importance to them. And it allows for extraction of resources. And of course, we must say that, the Artemis signature came at a time, during a visit in which you had so many other agreements for technological cooperation between India and the United States, right? For example, you had the HAL-GE deal on co-production of jet engines. You had an agreement on the sale of Sea Guardian UAVs and so on. So obviously, this is part of a set of agreements, that these two countries, and quid pro quos that these two countries have come together. We don't know what those quid pro quos were, but it's quite likely that such quid pro quos did exist. One quid pro quo, for example, is that it seems like at least one Indian astronaut will be trained with NASA and will probably go on a human mission to the International Space Station in 2024, right? So there are lots of things that are bringing these countries closer together, and there's obviously a lot of give and take, and that's probably what explains India's signature of the Artemis Accords.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, right? And I think India's capabilities are also increasing, and then I think with our own Gaganyaan project as well, I think those experiences would help with the other experiments that we are doing. So, I mean, apart from that, do you see that, what do you see the scope of cooperation between, competing ideas? I'm guessing that the elephant or the dragon in the room is the US-China relationship here. So, do you see it is like a space race redux, but with just more players? Or do you see this is as a flux, and eventually I think given that there are so many stakeholders involved, and it's not just like a showpiece thing that, okay, we went to the moon or space and now there are other economic benefits to be reaped from this. Do you see scope of cooperation, or do you also see that, okay, the space is going to also split into two or three?
Yeah, that's the question we're all wrestling with right now, because at the moment, when if I say lunar governance to people, people ask, what do you do for a living? Well, I spend most of my time thinking about lunar governance. People laugh at you, right? Well, understandably. But, the thing is, the case that we're making here is that this could potentially have all sorts of consequences in the years to come. Look, the moon is really far away and it's a very hostile environment. So it makes a lot of sense for countries to cooperate. We already have some important space laws, for example, on liability, on rescue, because we do recognize that even if, there's a spacecraft in low Earth orbit and you're able to rescue somebody, countries are obligated to do their best to help, right? Even if it's, a spacefarer from a country you don't like. It's like the laws of sea, when you are in a hostile environment, ultimately you do have to figure out ways to cooperate. So that has to occur. And when you are, for example, thinking about going to the moon, it is important that countries communicate with each other about what their plans are. Okay, this is exactly what I plan to do. This is where I plan to land. This is when I expect to be in so-and-so orbit. All right. So, all of these things are important to communicate to each other. So you need to have those sort of lines of communication. You need to have those institutional linkages, even between the US and China. It's absolutely important. And by the way, even the US and the Soviet Union recognized this during the Cold War. The second is, the more difficult challenges are, one, can countries cooperate technologically? And two, can countries cooperate on improving the legal frameworks, right? So in terms of technological cooperation, right now, there's a bit of US legislation that essentially prohibits NASA from collaborating in any substantial way with the Chinese. And the reason commonly cited is that the Chinese steal American technology. And I understand that, but you still have to find ways to collaborate, right? There are ways in which you can collaborate which don't involve exposing your technology, right? So you should find those, and you should find symbolic things, right? So in the Cold War, when a US and Soviet spacecraft in low Earth orbit dock together and astronauts shake hands, there's a powerful symbolic meaning to that, right? And it's a sort of it's a summit in space, really. They're acting like diplomats. And we should think of, when we're thinking about going to the moon, like, we should definitely think of ways of collaborating like that, or even just finding symbolic ways to say, look, we're all in this together ultimately, right? And if you're a Chinese taikonaut or an American astronaut on the moon, ultimately you really have more in common with each other in that circumstance than people back on Earth. So that, I think, has to be understood. Now, I'm less optimistic about the idea that we'll come up with overarching frameworks for the moon at this stage. It's possible that we will, but right now, problem is that the capabilities that countries have are still at their infancy, and we are also still not clear exactly what the business case is for the moon, right? So if you talk to NASA people, or if you just hear them talk about Artemis, one of the motives they'll have for Artemis is, look, ultimately you need to have that permanent presence and infrastructure on the moon if you're serious about going to Mars, right? The moon has to be that stepping stone for going to Mars. And Mars is a actual planet. It has a bit of atmosphere. It's somewhat less hostile than Earth, but it's very far away. That's the main challenge, right? So that's one reason. And to do that, you need water. And water is mostly found in the lunar polar regions and parts of the poles that, because of, mountain ridges and so on, have basically been shielded from the sun, so are very cold. So the ice remains where it is. So that water ice, right? Now, you need that water ice, obviously, because people need to drink water. You can extract the oxygen for it for people to breathe, and hydrogen and oxygen can act as fuel and oxidizer for rockets. So it's a really useful resource on the moon, and it's concentrated in specific parts of the poles, right? So you need to figure out, okay, you're saying, all right, all of us can extract, but you at some point need to figure out how you are going to share these resources, right? You help each other, or say, look, I'm going to be here in this area for now. Why don't you go there? In fact, I'll help you. You need to have that sort of agreement. And that, I think, will happen only when capabilities actually increase and countries actually get there and start seriously figuring out how to extract these resources and using them in situ. The other lunar resource that I think, is being seriously considered is simply the lunar regolith. And the lunar regolith is basically, it's a soil, and that soil is necessary if you are going to build any kind of permanent or semi-permanent habitation on the moon. Moon is just buffeted by radiation because there's no atmosphere. And look, realistically, despite what you see in movies, a lunar base isn't going to be mostly overground. It's probably going to be mostly underground because you need to shield people from that radiation. And regolith is a great way to help, pad up your lunar base. So I think that's going to be crucial. And now the good part is that regolith is not really in short supply. It's all over the moon. The challenge with regolith is that as soon as you start kicking it up, you can create massive lunar dust storms. Lunar dust is extremely fine, and and it's electrostatically charged. So it's very different from the Earth environment, and you can just, in this low gravity, no atmosphere environment, just kicking up even a bit of lunar dust can basically cause disruption to someone else, right? So you have to figure out how to deconflict this, how to basically be good neighbors, especially if you're both, say, in two parts of the South Pole of the moon. So, those are some of the challenges. Right now, the challenge isn't so much commercial extraction. That could change. So, for example, but that really depends on developments on Earth. So, for example, if nuclear fusion becomes a thing on Earth, you're going to need a lot of helium-3. And guess where you get a lot of helium-3? Probably around the equatorial regions of the moon. Right. So this is long term. As of this moment, it's science fiction, but it makes sense to start coming up with the rules for these things as soon as possible, rather than figuring them out when you're on the moon and making life difficult for each other. So, that's broadly the idea.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating. I mean, it shows that, like this time around, given the advances in technology and also maybe geopolitics and needs of, countries, and there are more players too. It's not just states now; it's also companies. So maybe I think the idea is that the moon is a stepping stone either for resources for the use on Earth, so let's say for fusion reactions, or to be as a base for exploration away from moon, so let's say about Mars. So this is all very, very exciting, and I'm sure many people in India, obviously, and also all over the globe are hoping that Chandrayaan-3 is successful, and we look forward to it. And then I look forward to talking to you again regarding, what is the next step? If our mission is successful, then what next, right? Will we have Chandrayaan 4, 5, or 7? So we can be ambitious that way. But so very much thank you, Aditya. We look forward to the developments in the next few days, and I'll talk to you again soon.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.